All right, so today we're going to talk about the end of World War I and the consequences of World War I. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about why 1917 was a big turning point. Then we're going to talk about the political, economic, and social consequences of the war. And one thing to keep in mind today is how World War I sets up for World War II. So if you have your water bottle handy and you take a drink every single time I mention Hitler, you're going to be super well hydrated by the end of this. All right, so 1917, how is this a turning point? Well, we already kind of mentioned it, right? There's a little switcheroo. So in April, the United States enters the war and provides a big boost to the other allies, so Britain and France. Russia, meanwhile, they are on their way out. So they have two revolutions in February slash March, and you're like, why is it 2 months? We'll talk about this when we talk about the Russian Revolution in the next lecture. The Tsar is overthrown, is replaced by a liberal democratic government. This doesn't actually affect the war too much. This government continues to fight the war, but then a little bit later, partly as a consequence of the government continuing to fight the war, which is very unpopular in Russia, a Marxist communist revolution occurs in October, and this new government pulls Russia out of the war. So they make peace with Germany, and by March of 1918, they are completely out of the war. So it's just America, Britain, and France on the side of the Allies. Now, Russia's withdrawal from the war does embolden the Germans to make one last major offensive, but this fails. Thank you, Americans, for providing some support here. All right, so 1918 marks the end of the war. So in September 1918, these German military leaders, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, who, if you recall from last lecture, have pretty much sidelined Kaiser Wilhelm. They're the ones pretty much kind of running the government. They come to Kaiser Wilhelm, they're like, okay, this isn't working, we need to get out of this. And so they say, hey, make peace. So Kaiser Wilhelm ends up abdicating in November, so he leaves. Well, why is that? So two reasons here. The first one is the Allies didn't really want to make peace with him. He's super authoritarian. He's super conservative. They're a little scared of him. He's a little crazy. Kaiser Wilhelm, this is not quite enough to push him to completely abdicate. But then a little bit later, in November, Germany actually has its own revolution. So we see kind of like we have a bunch of Marxists trying to seize power in Russia. A similar thing happens in Germany. Workers and soldiers revolt, and they force Kaiser Wilhelm out for good, and he goes into exile. It is actually a moderate socialist who ends up leading Germany after Kaiser Wilhelm abdicates. His name is Frederick Hebert. There are some more radical socialists, but we'll talk about them in a second. So Frederick Hebert becomes the head of a new German republic called the Weimar Republic. So if you've seen the movie Cabaret, very good movie, y'all should watch it. That is set during the Weimar Republic. So if you've heard that term before. All right, so this is the government that finally signs an armistice or a peace with the Allies on November 11th, 1918. And if you're like, November 11th, that date is familiar, Miss Sincere, that's Veterans Day. Yeah, we put Veterans Day on Armistice Day. So that is why that date is significant, and we get it off. All right. Well, what does this armistice do? Well, it initially has some major consequences for Germany, leads to some short-term chaos there, which will eventually become long-term chaos. And this actually has to do with the socialists. So the divide between kind of those socialists who want to just sort of implement socialist policy, work within kind of a liberal democratic framework, implement some legal reforms. They've got those guys. And then we've got revolutionary socialists who want to kind of flip the table over and have a total revolution and reestablish this new government that's going to seize everyone's property and redistribute it. That divide has deepened during the war, and they actually split into two different parties. So the reformists stay part of Friedrich Ebert's Social Democratic Party, or the SPD. The revolutionaries break off, and they form this new party called the Communist Party, or the KPD. The initials are in German there. So after Germany signs the armistice, the KPD revolts. They want to go further. And remember, it's the moderate socialists in charge, so we got socialists revolting against socialists here. And, well, what's going on here? Why is the KPD revolting? Well, remember, Russia has just had a full-on communist revolution, and the KPD wants to join them. They are inspired, they are energized, they want the same thing to happen. Now, what does Ebert, this moderate socialist, do? Well, he actually makes an alliance with the conservatives, and you're like, whoa, socialists making alliance with conservatives, that's wild. Yes, it is. He makes an alliance with conservatives, and he crushes the revolt, and he murders the leaders of the KPD, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and that has some pretty significant long-term consequences for Germany? Well, the first thing is it does kind of solve in the short term the revolution problem. So the stability of the Weimar Republic is restored, but it leaves some kind of problems in its wake. First problem, it sows a very deep fear of communism among the German middle class because they just saw communists come very close to having a full-on communist revolution like they did in Russia. So the German middle class is very scared of having their property taken away. What's the consequence of that? Well, one of the big things that Hitler does when he comes to power, and we'll talk about this more next unit, but he exploits that fear of communism. So he uses that to gain support. Second thing is also related to Hitler. So what this suppression of the KPD's revolt does is it deepens those divisions between the radical socialists and the moderate socialists, which limits their ability to come together and unite and form an opposition to Hitler. So again, both these things are going. The socialist revolting ends up helping a fascist come to power. So stay tuned for that. All right. So we also see some chaos in Austria-Hungary. They collapse, finally. They've been on their last legs for a while, so that was kind of a long time coming, but not surprising. And they collapse into a bunch of different smaller republics. So we've got Austria, or states rather. They're not all republics. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And then there are some other territorial changes, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Right now, let's take a look at that actual peace, that armistice that was signed. Okay, well, so the armistice has been signed. The war is over, but what are we going to do afterwards? How are we going to rebuild? So in January of 1919, the Allied nations meet in Paris to decide the terms of the peace. Now, it's only the Allies, so it is the big three, as we call them, United States, Britain, and France. Notice that Russia, the former ally, is not invited, nor is Germany. So the victors really get to decide the terms of this peace. You can imagine how that will turn out. Now, these victors don't all have the same priorities, though. So the Americans are very idealistic. So they are led by President Woodrow Wilson. And he is, if you imagine Mean Girls, you remember that girl who shows up at the end who wants to bake a cake out of rainbows and smiles and hopes that everyone will be happy? That's Woodrow Wilson. So he issues this statement of purpose called the 14 Points, in which he expressed his desire for the peace to be based on principles of democracy and international cooperation and self-determination, which means he wants all these countries involved to be able to control their own affairs. So he's all like, let's make everyone happy. I love democracy. Let's make Europe stable and wonderful forever. Now, meanwhile, Britain and France, they suffered a lot more than the United States, right? So they are ready for revenge, pretty much. Britain wants to punish Germany. France wants to punish Germany. And then France also, mind you, because they got invaded, right? They want protection against future German aggression. So they really push for German demilitarization. So they want Germany to have like fewer weapons. And they also want a physical buffer zone between themselves and Germany, right? Now, both Britain and France also want some protection against communism, right? Because Germany just had a very near miss. Russia is now under a communist government. Britain and France do not want this. So that is also a priority for them. All right, so the big three ultimately come to a compromise. So in order to satisfy Wilson, they create this thing called the League of Nations, which is a precursor to the United Nations. But the problem is, in the United States, Woodrow Wilson's all ready to join this, but Congress is not. And so the United States doesn't actually join the League of Nations that they wanted, which we can see from the start, right? We have this big, great power not joining it who wanted it. So that's problematic. Now, Britain and France's desire for revenge really dictated the peace with Germany, which is formalized in this document called the Treaty of Versailles, which is going to be very, very important. You should definitely have it on a flashcard. Very significant here. All right, well, what's the Treaty of Versailles about? Oh boy, look at that. That's long. Well, it had really big, significant negative consequences for Germany. And Germany did not like any of it. And remember, they're not part of dictating it. So yeah, you can imagine how harsh it is, right? Or how harsh at least they perceived it. So the first thing that they didn't like was a thing called Article 231, or the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept responsibility for starting the war and forced them to pay reparations, i.e. money, for the damage, right? So basically, the War Guilt Clause says, Germany, it's your fault, and you got to pay money. And we'll talk about the impact of this money in a second. Now, Germany also had to reduce the size of its military. Remember, France is afraid, right? They had to give up their colonies. They had to give up some territory to Poland, which has now become independent from Russia. And we'll talk about that next time. And they also have to give up this territory called the Alsace-Lorraine region to France, which, by the way, they stole during the Franco-Prussian War. So there's some precedent there. Now, historians debate how harsh this treaty really was. And they especially debate sort of the economic impact of the reparations. So you'll hear a lot of times you say, oh, the Treaty of Versailles, the fact they had to pay these huge reparations was just totally devastating to Germany. And they didn't have the money to do it, right? Because they'd spent all this money on the war. It's Germany was economically devastated. I will not argue that. And they suffered from really severe hyperinflation after the war. So basically, the value of the German mark, which is their currency, went way, way down. So people weren't able to pay for things. But some historians argue that this had to do not necessarily with the reparations themselves, but to Germany's response to the reparations. So Germany actually, they decided that rather than use the money they already had to pay for reparations, they were going to print more money, which is a really good way to cause inflation. And then moreover, Germany actually missed a payment on their reparations in 1922, which led French troops to occupy this region called the Ruhr Valley, which was this really important industrial region in Germany, which led workers there to go on strike because they did not want to be occupied by France. So what did Germany do? They actually paid the striking workers. They paid their salaries. But how did they do that? Did they pay it with money they already had? Nope, they printed more money, which further devalued the currency. So again, it's like, well, was it the reparations that caused the problem, or was it Germany's reaction to the reparations? Now, let's think, okay, well, what impact did the treaty actually have? But what's not debatable is that a lot of Germans felt that this was really unfair, right? Because they didn't have to say it, a say in it, right? They felt like it was like this quote unquote dictated peace. It was imposed on them, and they felt like it was really harsh, regardless of how harsh it actually was. Now, again, third reason, so Hitler, this is going to help Hitler come to power too, right? So Hitler really exploited that sense of anger, that sense of grievance and humiliation in his rise to power. So we'll stay tuned for that next unit. All right, other political consequences of the war. So I mentioned there were more territorial changes, right? So we get some new states in Eastern Europe. Some of these we already mentioned, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia in Eastern Europe. A lot of new states emerged from the Russian Empire too. So when Russia made peace with Germany, they gave up a lot of territory, including Poland and Belarus and Ukraine. The Ottoman Empire is another big empire that's on its last legs. It finally collapses too, and that creates some new states in the Middle East. The thing though is that these states aren't really fully independent. So Lebanon and Syria are created, but they get under the control of France. Iraq and Palestine are created, but they're under the control of Britain. Now, Britain also does this thing. So they issued this document called the Balfour Declaration. So remember, kind of Zionism is starting to pick up with the rise in anti-Semitism. So Jewish people are like, why don't we go move to Palestine? And Britain's like, sure, cool. Yeah, you guys can do that, I guess. So what these examples, by the way, in the Middle East illustrate, not just that like new territories emerge from the war, but they also highlight, that one of the principles of or at least of Wilson, was this idea of self-determination, right? We want these countries, we want, Czechoslovakia and Ukraine and stuff to control their own destinies. But, well, if you're in the Middle East, too bad. No, you're just new colonies, I guess. All right, other cultural and social consequences. So let's move on from political consequences a little bit. Well, really the biggest and most significant one was the loss of life. So about 9 million people were killed in the war, with an additional 21 million people suffering injuries. You can imagine the impact that would have on your daily life, right? And then that massive loss of life created this just culture, like, across Europe, really, and not so much the United States, a little bit, just created this sense of trauma and grief. And just as a connection to my own personal experience, so my great-grandfather fought in World War I, and he suffered really significant trauma from it, and he ended up actually dying by suicide, which really affected my grandfather, as you can imagine. So it has some impact on my own personal history here, too. Now, all this, adding to that was, so on the tail of the war, so in 1918, 1919, there was a really significant flu pandemic, which actually probably originated in the United States, and that killed about 50 million more people. Now, all this loss of life, so the war and the pandemic, led to an economic recession across Europe, right? So another significant cultural or social consequence that emerged from the war was decolonization. Now, I mentioned, right, okay, well, these new kind of quasi-colonies are created in the Middle East. Well, how does this lead to decolonization? That seems contradictory. Well, remember, right, we have all these troops coming from Africa and from Asia, right, going to fight for their European colonial overlords, right? Well, these colonial soldiers felt like they weren't treated very well. They experienced significant racism from the European troops. And they're like, well, what are we doing? We're fighting for these countries that don't care for us, right? So you've got that going on. And then you've got Wilson promoting self-determination. They're like, well, we don't have that, right? So what it did is it just highlighted again the hypocrisy, right, of how the Europeans were ruling their colonies. So all these colonial soldiers came home and they're like, well, why can't we have independence? So it's going to start to lay the foundation. There's not full decolonization. They don't rise up just quite yet, but it's definitely going to lay the foundation for that, which we'll pick up after World War II as well. All right. Actually, the last consequence we're going to talk about is a big change in the role of women. So, as we mentioned, a lot of women took factory jobs that were traditionally held by men during the war. Well, they didn't keep these jobs. Once the men came back home from war, they just kind of picked up where they left off, and the women were fired. Um, and but that didn't. There were some gains in other areas. So, in Britain, for example, property owning women over the age of 30 gained the right to vote. So it's about 2/3 of British women. So not all British women gained the right to vote, but quite a few did. In Russia, where they've just had a communist revolution, as we recall, right? They create this really sweeping program to attempt to advance women's rights. They create like a new family law code that allowed for no-fault divorce, so you could get a divorce for no reason. You didn't have to prove that you deserved a divorce. And child support. They also legalized abortion, probably one of the first European countries to do that, although they will end up criminalizing it again kind of shortly thereafter. So another interesting thing is that this newfound kind of sense of freedom and independence, it led women across Europe and in the United States, for that matter, to kind of change how they dressed and presented themselves. So they cut their hair short, they wore shorter dresses. If you've heard of the flappers, yeah, that's them, and that's where they came from.